Iranian ballistic missiles struck Ben Gurion International Airport 2 minutes ago. It was not a military base, a radar installation, or a power grid. It was the airport, the single piece of infrastructure that every foreign government, airline, evacuating civilian, and incoming supply chain depends on to maintain a physical connection between Israel and the rest of the world. The runways are not operational, and the terminal has sustained a direct impact. The airspace over central Israel has been declared closed by Israeli aviation authorities in language that does not include a reopening timeline. The flights that were in the air when the missiles hit, the ones that were 20 minutes from landing, carrying passengers who had no idea what was happening on the ground below them, have been diverted. They were not delayed. They were diverted to Amman, Larnaca, or Athens, or wherever their fuel load could carry them that was not Ben Gurion. Israel is now an island. This is not a metaphorical description of its political isolation, but a literal reality. The physical infrastructure that connects Israel to every other country on Earth by air has just been struck by Iranian ballistic missiles and declared non-operational by the government that has been telling its civilian population for weeks that the airport was protected, defended, and not a target Iran could reach without consequence. Every one of those assurances was either wrong or a deliberate misrepresentation of the defensive reality that the government knew but chose not to share. Israeli civilians who are now trying to leave, foreign nationals who have been waiting for an evacuation window, medical supplies that were scheduled to land this morning, and military equipment that was inbound through civilian logistics channels now have no path in or out of Israel. This is not a military inconvenience. It is a strategic siege condition achieved without a single soldier crossing a border. In the next few minutes, I will show you exactly what Iran struck at Ben Gurion and why the airport was a more consequential target than any military installation Iran has hit in this conflict. You will see what the Israeli government knew about the airport's vulnerability and chose not to say publicly, what it means for Israel's ability to sustain a military campaign when its primary logistics and evacuation node has been removed from the operational picture, and why the closure of Ben Gurion Airport is the single most strategically significant strike Iran has conducted since the first missile was fired on February 28th. Thanks for watching. Your support is what keeps this going, and I genuinely appreciate every one of you. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this. To understand why the Ben Gurion strike is categorically different from every other strike Iran has conducted in this conflict, you need to understand what the airport actually is in the context of a country under sustained ballistic missile bombardment. Its continued operation was not just a civilian convenience, but a strategic necessity that the entire Israeli war effort depended on. Ben Gurion is not simply Israel's largest airport. In the current conflict, it has functioned as the primary node through which Israel maintains every category of connection to the outside world that sustains both its civilian population and its military campaign. Military resupply from the United States has been moving through Ben Gurion, not exclusively through military channels, but through civilian logistics infrastructure that has been handling dual-use cargo on commercial and charter flights operating under civilian aviation codes. Interceptor components that Rafael Advanced Defense Systems cannot produce fast enough domestically have been arriving through Ben Gurion. The precision munitions that Israel's Air Force has been expending against Iranian launch infrastructure have been partially resupplied through the airport. Medical supplies required by a nation sustaining continuous ballistic missile strikes on its civilian population have also been arriving there. Furthermore, foreign nationals, dual citizens, journalists, diplomatic personnel, and international humanitarian workers, every category of person whose presence in Israel depends on the ability to leave when conditions require it, have been moving through Ben Gurion. This combination of functions made Ben Gurion not just Israel's largest airport, but its most strategically critical piece of non-military infrastructure in the entire conflict. Iran knew that. The question the Israeli government has not answered publicly is what it did about it. The defensive architecture positioned to protect Ben Gurion Airport was subject to the same interceptor attrition campaign that has depleted coverage over Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, Haifa, and every other Israeli population center throughout this conflict. When Netanyahu's security cabinet made the decision to concentrate remaining interceptors over the Tel Aviv to Jerusalem government and military corridor, Ben Gurion Airport sat at the southern edge of that corridor. However, sitting at the edge of a priority coverage zone is not the same as being at the center of it. The coverage density over Ben Gurion after the concentration decision was materially lower than the density over the government and military infrastructure at the core of the priority zone. Iran's targeting apparatus, which has been observing interceptor redistribution movements and coverage pattern changes throughout this conflict, was watching that coverage density degrade in real time. The strike package Iran assembled for Ben Gurion was calibrated to the specific defensive conditions over the airport at the time of the strike, not to the conditions that existed at the beginning of the conflict, or those implied by the Israeli government's public communications, but to the actual conditions They targeted a degraded, depleted, and redistributed defensive environment that 4 weeks of sustained attrition had produced. And the strike worked. The most consequential dimension is what a closed Ben Gurion means for Israel's ability to sustain the military campaign it has been conducting. The American military resupply pipeline that has been partially running through civilian logistics channels at Ben Gurion does not have a readily available alternative routing that operates at the same capacity and on the same timeline. Overflight permissions from neighboring countries for military resupply aircraft have been politically complicated throughout this conflict. Jordan has been managing its relationship with both Israel and Iran with a careful neutrality that has limited the overflight permissions it has been willing to grant for flights that are visibly military in nature. Egypt has been similarly constrained. The moment Israel redirects its critical military logistics pipeline to Ramon Airport in the Negev, Ramon becomes the next Ben Gurion. It becomes the node whose closure would sever the resupply connection. Iran has already demonstrated tonight that it has the range, accuracy, and remaining launch capacity to strike civilian airport infrastructure through Israel's degraded defensive envelope. The secondary strategic consequence of the Ben Gurion closure is the evacuation question that the Israeli government has been managing quietly throughout this conflict, and that the airport strike has just forced into the open. There are approximately 170,000 foreign nationals registered with their embassies in Israel. The number of those who have been unable or unwilling to leave through the windows that remained available before this morning's strike is significant. The embassies that have been managing evacuation queues, processing documentation, and coordinating with airlines for prioritized departure slots all depended on Ben Gurion remaining operational. Those processes are now suspended. Foreign nationals waiting for their evacuation slot are now in a country with no functioning international airport and no confirmed timeline for when one will become available. The governments of those foreign nationals are now calling Jerusalem and Washington to ask how to evacuate their citizens from a country whose only international airport has just been struck and declared non-operational. The honest answer is that you don't, not quickly, not at scale, and not in a way that matches the urgency the situation demands. The Israeli government has not issued updated guidance to foreign nationals following the strike. It has not told foreign embassies what the timeline for airport restoration looks like, nor has it communicated to the international community whether the runway damage is repairable in hours, days, or a longer time frame that changes the strategic calculus of every watching country. That silence follows the same pattern this government has demonstrated regarding interceptor depletion, Dimona damage, and nuclear-capable missile warheads. In each case, the government possesses information it chooses not to share, forcing civilians, foreign nationals, and governments to bear the consequences of an incomplete disclosure calculus. The geopolitical consequences of Ben Gurion being non-operational extend into the diplomatic and economic dimensions of this conflict. Israel's economy has been under sustained pressure throughout this war. Insurance markets that price risk for shipping and aviation to conflict zones have been steadily increasing their assessments. Ben Gurion being struck by ballistic missiles is not just a risk assessment event, it is a risk realization event. Every airline that had been maintaining reduced service on the calculation that the airport was protected has just watched that calculation prove incorrect. The question of whether any commercial airline resumes service before the conflict ends is almost certainly answered with a no. The economic isolation that follows compounds the military logistics problem. A country that cannot receive commercial flights cannot receive the full range of dual-use supplies and equipment that a civilian logistics network handles. It cannot maintain the presence of the international business and humanitarian communities. To every government and market watching, Israel now looks like a country that is losing, not necessarily militarily in the sense of targeting maps, but in the strategic sense of sustaining public support for a campaign that has produced the closure of its primary international gateway. The Netanyahu government's political position following the Ben Gurion strike is the most precarious it has been since the conflict began. That is not a low bar to clear, given the 5 uncontested strikes on Tel Aviv, 2 strikes on Jerusalem, and 2 strikes on Dimona, whose combined damage has not been disclosed. Add to that a nuclear-capable missile whose warhead contents have not been confirmed, and now a direct strike on Ben Gurion International Airport that has grounded every flight and closed the airspace over central Israel at the moment when the need for that node is highest. Each of those previous events has been survivable for a government with Netanyahu's narrative management skills. However, the Ben Gurion strike is harder to survive narratively because previous strikes hit infrastructure that most civilians do not interact with directly, such as military bases or desert research facilities. Even the Tel Aviv and Jerusalem strikes hit areas that most Israelis could process as something happening to others. The airport is different. Every Israeli has been to Ben Gurion. Every Israeli has a family member or friend who is now either stranded abroad or stranded in Israel. This is the first event in the conflict that every Israeli civilian experiences as something that happened directly to them. It is not an abstract city or infrastructure they value but do not use. It is the airport they rely on as the option of last resort if the situation becomes untenable. That option is gone. The American response to the Ben Gurion strike is being discussed in the White House Situation Room right now. The question being asked is not whether to respond, but how to respond to a strike that has severed the primary logistics node through which American military resupply has been flowing. The open question the strike leaves hanging over the conflict and every watching government is the same one that has been building since the first Tel Aviv strike, but the airport closure has made it impossible to defer. Ben Gurion can be repaired, runways can be reconstructed, and terminals can be rebuilt, but Iran has now demonstrated it can strike Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Dimona, can put a nuclear-capable missile into Israel's largest city, and can effectively close the airport that connects Israel to the world. If Iran's strike on Ben Gurion Airport has removed the primary logistics and evacuation node from the operational picture at the moment when the conflict is at its most intense, what does the closure of the airport that every Israeli civilian uses personally do to the domestic political sustainability of a government that assured its population the airport was protected? What does Iran's demonstrated ability to close Ben Gurion tell you about which piece of Israeli infrastructure it has already identified as the next target on a list that has systematically worked through every category of critical national infrastructure since February 28th? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated on this, and click the video on screen to see another one. I will see you soon.